Inside the stories that affect you. This is Inside KELOLAND.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Addiction is the desire to feel better, and trauma can be at the root of it, especially childhood trauma. According to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, nearly 20 million Americans ages 12 and up battle substance use disorder. 1 out of every 8 adults struggle with both alcohol and drug use disorders simultaneously. But the actual lives being destroyed by addiction tell the story much better than statistics ever will. Tonight, we have a unique look inside the life of a woman struggling with substance use disorder.
Growing up, my parents had no problems with me. I never had detention. Never got in trouble. I never snuck out. I never really did anything wrong. I think I drank one time during high school when I was 16.
That was also the age Jessica Fowl began to struggle with her weight. She now realizes she was addicted to food. In 2011, she underwent gastric bypass surgery. That's when her problems with painkillers began.
Traded my food for pain pills after that.
Did you know you were addicted?
Maybe. I knew I had a problem and I took too many, but I always thought I could stop.
Failed treatment after failed treatment led her to the realization of what had caused her to want to numb the pain, trauma from her childhood. She didn't want to go into specific details, but she did tell us this.
I didn't deal with it. I didn't open up about it. I wasn't honest about things that were going on around me.
Sometimes when it does happen in childhood, it does have an impact on how they manage stress a little bit later in their life if they don't develop the skills to be able to help better manage some of those life stressors.
Jessica's way of coping was to turn from food to pills to booze and eventually harder drugs.
Addiction can be kind of a slippery slope, so oftentimes you maybe just have a beer or a glass of wine to be able to kind of numb out or to kind of cope with that situation. And then over time, that 1 turns into 2, that 2 turns into 3, that 1 night a week turns into 2, 3, and over time that continues to progress where that person starts to develop a dependence or addiction to that substance.
You don't feel anything. You don't feel happy, but you don't feel the sadness.
While Jessica used food to deal with her trauma initially, gastric bypass surgery changed that. Most patients who undergo the surgery are prescribed some kind of opioid to cope with the pain. But several new studies show that gastric bypass patients may be most at risk of developing opioid addiction. That was the case for Jessica Fowl, who had what's known as addiction transfer from food to painkillers, and she was hooked.
Who's that in there? Watch this, I'll show you. I wanted a child my entire life. We tried throughout my first marriage, and it never happened.
But at 36 years old, after that marriage had ended, Jessica, who thought she couldn't have children, was pregnant.
He cried over that.
At the time I found out I was pregnant, I had a scram bracelet on and was doing 3 UAs a week at 24/7.
To understand how Jessica found herself pregnant and in DUI court, you have to go back to 2011. Her weight had been an issue since she was 16.
Throughout the years, it just got out of control, and I got to the point where I weighed close to 400 pounds.
Jessica underwent gastric bypass surgery and was prescribed opioid painkillers.
And traded my food for pain pills after that. I was depressed. I had liquid meals. I was used to eating whatever I wanted to and when I wanted to. And I took the pain med, realized that it made me feel warm and fuzzy, and I got a little bit of that comfort feeling back.
She says she was desperate for the pills and started doctor shopping. Eventually, she was caught and her supply cut off. In 2013, she turned to the streets to buy her opioid pills.
Do you blame the doctors?
I don't know that I blame the doctors. What I wish is that people would be more educated before having a surgery like that, the gastric bypass, because what I have learned doing research is like a large percentage, 60 to 75% of people do become addicted to alcohol or other drugs after the gastric bypass surgery.
Bariatric surgeon Dr. Veronica Guerrero did not perform Fow's surgery, but confirms that gastric bypass patients are up to 3 times more likely to abuse alcohol or drugs. It's called addiction transfer.
And with bariatric surgery, their diet is so restricted, and that's a good thing, that's how it works. But then unfortunately they might find other tendencies to replace that void of that emotional drive to take something in and feel different.
She says patients are being prescribed fewer opioids after surgery. In Jessica's case, she got fired from her job for falling asleep repeatedly at her desk while on opioids. A few months later, she sought treatment at a methadone clinic. But but she missed getting her doses over a long weekend and went into withdrawal.
I thought I was dying. I thought I was crawling out of my own skin. My legs would tremble so bad. I mean, I've been through childbirth, and you can't even compare the two. The withdrawals are something, that's what I think scares a lot of people from quitting. It's what scared me for a long time.
That's when Jessica turned to alcohol, which is more rapidly absorbed by gastric bypass patients. They also have a more intense and longer-lasting response to the effects of alcohol. Whiskey was Jessica's drink of choice.
I mean, you drink just a little bit and you're blacked out and down.
Several attempts at treatment were unsuccessful, and Jessica racked up the drunk driving charges.
I'm not sure I thought much of myself because I was drunk almost all the time. I just didn't care anymore about anything.
What made it even worse was the judgment of others as her world fell apart. Your intention was not to become an addict.
No, never. Never to hurt my family in the way that I have and to hurt myself in the way that I have. So I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
After failing the 24/7 program, she was required to wear a scram ankle bracelet.
With that bracelet on, I went back to the pills.
Because it didn't detect?
It doesn't detect pills, just alcohol.
Then she crossed a line.
My whole life, I said there's two things that I would never do. One was prostitution, and two was shoot up drugs. And there's still only one that I haven't done.
She couldn't get the pills from her dealer.
And he said, but I can keep you out of withdrawal. I have something else you can try. And he came over with heroin. That's the day that it switched to heroin, being the love of my life.
Jessica explains the insatiable craving for heroin.
It steals your soul and just takes off with it. So.
It steals your soul?
Mm-hmm. Yep, you become, that's your number one love. Nothing matters like that. I mean, all I wanted was that feeling. You chase it, and it's never the same as it was in the beginning, and it takes more of it. You're married to your drug.
But Jessica had also gotten remarried to Greg Fowl, who she met in drug court when she was pregnant during a longer period of sobriety.
I've got 30 plus years of using, so I've had enough.
But fate wasn't on Jessica's side. She had a perforated ulcer and required surgery. Despite her history with substance use disorder, especially with opioids, she was given hydromorphone.
I literally almost died. He made the decision that he would take the chance to do that. The doctor did.
Jessica says after that, she constantly craved the drug and hid her use from Greg.
I assumed that since we were both the same kind of people, that it wouldn't be a big deal to say, hey, I'm having trouble. Can you help me here? And I got none of that.
I didn't choose to be an addict, but at the same time, what do you do with an addict that won't quit?
What do you do with an addict that won't quit? 80% of the women in South Dakota's prisons are struggling with addiction. Are they getting the treatment they need? We'll look into that question ahead and bring you the second part of Jessica's journey. A lot of people squirm at the thought of injecting a drug into their veins, but heroin, meth, or cocaine addiction does not start out that way. People typically begin smoking or ingesting drugs. As their dependence increases, they seek a stronger, faster high, and they find it with needles. That was the case for Jessica Fowl, where the addiction wasn't just to the chemical anymore.
I've learned, through the treatment I've been through, that cravings are okay to have, and I used to be afraid to even tell anybody about them.
Jessica Fowl believes her addictive tendencies are rooted in childhood trauma. After years of being addicted to food, Jessica underwent gastric bypass and then got hooked on the painkillers after surgery. When she could no longer get opioid pills, she switched to alcohol. While she was being monitored for alcohol by the courts, she went back to opioids, eventually shooting up with heroin.
It gets really old, but for some reason at the time, if you don't have the right resources and you're not in the right mind frame and you don't want something different and you haven't been taught how to cope with different things, it doesn't matter. You still don't think of all the consequences, you just think of the drug.
Jessica has been through several treatments, none of them stuck. Still, she didn't want to go back to the drug.
I was not using drugs, but I was shooting up water.
What?
The needle addiction is almost just as bad as the drug addiction.
It could potentially be some sort of behavioral addiction that person also has in addition to that chemical addiction.
You get almost a rush too when you use a syringe and you see your blood pull back when you're in a vein. It's almost like a rush in itself.
So you're still participating in that addictive behavior. So I think it'd almost be similar to the concept of a dry drunk. So, they're really kind of doing all the same thing that incorporates with that addiction piece. They've only just kind of removed that chemical from the whole situation.
Previous obsessive traits can set someone up for the compulsive behavior.
And it's kind of been that way with everything. If I like it and if I'm interested, I don't stop.
So they're using that, injecting water as a coping skill to be able to kind of manage stress, life situations.
Using needles in this way is not safe and puts people at risk for diseases like HIV and hepatitis. Just ahead, Fao tells us what led up to her near-fatal overdose. She had no idea the drug she used was laced with fentanyl. Plus, we follow her as she turns herself in to serve her prison sentence. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. Tonight we're sharing one woman's struggle with addiction, from food to opioid pills and alcohol to eventually heroin. For the last 8 years, Jessica Fao has been in and out of the legal system, but hasn't been able to find the right treatment for her substance use disorder. She's even come frighteningly close to death. Now she's spending time behind bars, but if she'll get the appropriate treatment is in question.
Scary?
Scary.
He's not scary. Everything's scary to you. Here, let's look at the next page.
Jessica Fao will never be the same woman she was before 2011, but not because she lost 200 pounds after gastric bypass surgery. Jessica's struggle with substance use disorder has changed the course of her life. Despite the high success rate of DUI court, Jessica was not among those happy stories.
I don't blame DUI court at all for terminating me because I was completely untrustworthy at the time. I lied to them about everything. I don't have any blame to that program.
She couldn't stop using and ended up in the women's prison in Pierre for 3 months in 2018. She says prison set her back even further.
Some of the darkest, worst times of my life.
The most difficult was being apart from her husband, Greg, and her toddler son.
I can't get the time back that I've lost. And I wasn't supposed to be able to have children. I was always told I couldn't, so I know that he's the only one I'll have. And missing his life because of the choices I made.
When she got out, she gave up all hope of recovery.
Nothing was the same. There was no trust. I felt like I had let my best friend down. I let my son down. I missed so many different things. I got overwhelmed, and one day I just got so overwhelmed that I was like, screw it. I'm not going to go to work today. I'm going to go find something and I'm going to use.
She hadn't used for 7 months. However, on March 18th, she bought what she thought were crushed up OxyContin pills.
I knew what it could lead to, but the pull was so strong of not wanting to feel anymore that eventually I went and bought like 3 little shooters of vodka just so I could have the courage to go into Lewis drugstore and buy the syringes and use in the parking lot.
Greg called her as she began to put the needle in her arm and asked her to come home. She remembers telling him no.
Somebody walked out to their car and saw that I was passed out in my vehicle with a needle in my arm and called.
Paramedics on the scene revived her with Narcan. What was in the drug?
Heroin. Laced with fentanyl, I believe, is what they had said.
It was fentanyl. Did you go to the emergency room? What kind of help have you been given?
I was in the ER, and then once they stabilized me, I was put in county jail on the new charges.
You weren't offered any kind of medically assisted treatment for opioid addiction?
No.
A judge sentenced Jessica to 2 years in prison for possession, ingestion, and her 6th DUI because she had been behind the wheel of a car when she overdosed.
How do you prepare a 2.5-year-old or almost 3-year-old that, mommy's not going to be here for a while? And that's a heartbreaker for me because Monday when I do report to go back to prison, he's going to lose that trust because I'm not going to be back. And what I've gained with my husband in the last 7 months is not just put on hold, but I'm afraid it's going to go backwards.
Will you get treatment in prison?
There is no treatment in prison, not in the women's prison. They're really short on counselors.
According to the Department of Social Services, which provides treatment programs in prisons, only 3 of 5 addiction counselor positions in the women's prison are filled.
Yeah, I don't think we do enough in our prison system. If people are sitting there in prison and not getting any help, I think we're doing them a disservice.
Governor Noem says 80% of the women in prison are struggling with addiction issues. Noem says she's calling on the Department of Corrections to come up with a more comprehensive plan and follow-up care once an inmate is released. But Jessica says she has found help in her church. Members of the Sioux Falls Church of Christ and her family accompanied Jessica as she reported to jail to begin serving her sentence.
For me, 12-step programs, treatment alone didn't work. I went back to church, and the people in my congregation, the way they've reached out and supported and helped.
She hopes that her faith and the support of her church will make a difference during her second stint in prison. In her final moments of freedom, there's one person whose forgiveness she feels she has finally received.
My mom at supper time last night looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I would go for you if I could." And for her to say that, I know that things are getting better. I know that those amends have started to be made. She would have never said that to me before. I love you. Bye. For the first time in my life, I don't desire to go back to that life. I don't desire to be numb anymore. Feeling whether it be good or bad, it's not easy, but it's completely better than any other life I've lived.
Jessica's loved ones are hopeful that her story doesn't end the way so many others have.
She can't use again. That would be why I would kill her.
KELOLAND Investigates asked the Department of Corrections if we could bring our news camera to the women's prison in Pierre to show what treatment Jessica receives. Although we do have her consent, a DOC spokesperson told us that request violates DOC policy and confidentiality standards associated with treatment. We will, however, follow Jessica's story through her prison sentence, and when she gets released, we'll bring you updates on how she is doing. If you or a loved one is struggling with addiction, we have put resources on our opioid crisis page for you on KELOLAND.com. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. Many people are living right now with substance use disorder. Some have found themselves behind bars. But is that the best place for someone who needs help? Well, KELOLAND digital data reporter Ray Yost looked into that question, as well as a number of people in prison related to drug charges. Thank you for joining us, Ray.
Thank you.
And you are new to the KELOLAND family.
Yes,
Tell
I am.
our audience a little bit about yourself.
I've been in journalism for more than 25 years and just joined KELOLAND at the 1st of November.
And you are working on KELOLAND.com, and we are making a very concerted effort to put a lot of content for people on air always, of course, but also online.
Yeah, yes, we are. It's an effort, digital first, which doesn't mean broadcast second or anything, but it's an effort to enhance and supplement and provide some unique coverage or particular coverage online on our website.
So, and I really appreciated it when I was working on this story with Jessica Fowl and her family and talking to other people. I really appreciated you stepping up to look into some of the data for me, to look into how many women are in prison because of drug charges.
Yeah. Your story was a perfect example of the meshing and the role and the partnership between online and my particular job with broadcast. Jessica's journey was the story of one woman, but I provided some background and some context to say, how does Jessica fit in the whole piece of how many women in South Dakota are actually in prison?
And the governor had mentioned during that interview that she believes about 80% of women are suffering from addiction. Now, that doesn't mean 80% of women are in for drug crimes.
No. I found when I was looking for information on that in the end of 2018, about 65% of the women in prison were in prison because of drug crimes.
And that's a lot I mean, that's more than a majority, and that is a lot more than men in prison for drug charges, right?
Yeah, men tend to be in prison more based on the data that I found for violent crimes or, non-violent, but
I think
not
we have a chart
crimes.
of that. Maybe we can show people.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah. So this is one of the things, you made this chart after
Yes.
looking at some of the data. What are we looking at here?
Well, what we're looking at here is the difference between male and female inmates and what the top 3 categories you would say: drug, nonviolent, violent.
A reason why they're spending time
The reason why
behind
they're in,
bars.
the reason why they're in prison. And you can clearly see that females or women are in prison far more for drug crimes than men.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And so many of them, even who aren't then in prison necessarily for drugs, are also still suffering from some kind of addiction, some kind of problems as well. And you also talked with officials about how they're treating those women.
Yeah, in the South Dakota Department of Corrections, the State Department of Social Services handles a lot of the drug treatment in prisons. They have a program that's specifically dedicated toward meth, and then a second program that's dedicated more toward opioid use. And they're both voluntary programs.
So they aren't required. It's not mandatory that they go through the treatment.
No, it's my understanding.
Even if they're in for drug charges.
It's my understanding that it's all voluntary. But the women who come in, they are screened or evaluated, however you would like to say that, within the first 2 weeks of entering prison, so that they can be evaluated if they have a drug problem, or perhaps there's a mental health issue, or perhaps there's both.
Did the social services people that you spoke with in the South Dakota Department of Social Services, did they tell you why it's so hard to keep counselors in that position? There's a shortage, and there's a different shortages in different areas.
We didn't specifically talk about that as much as just what the staffing was like in the prison system. I think it's there's 5 counselors that are dedicated to women in the addiction treatment, but there's 2 of 5 positions that were open at the time we did the story. I think that's maybe symptomatic or maybe illustrative of the mental health counseling needs.
Just a shortage in general,
Yeah, I would think so.
in all areas.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Let's talk about ingestion for a minute, because that's another thing that people are charged with and put in prison for in South Dakota, and it's relatively unusual.
It's unusual in that South Dakota is the only state that has a felony charge for ingestion. There are several other states that do have ingestion laws, but they tend to be misdemeanors or even petty misdemeanors. So it doesn't rise to the level of crime or the punishment as it would in South Dakota.
And have you looked at other states in terms of how they're treating this whole problem in general?
Just a little in terms of comparison. I think they are all paying attention to the fact that, people do get arrested for drug crimes. They may enter prison, particularly women may enter prison for drug crimes. And then they look at, okay, where are they at? Does that mean they have a problem or an issue with it?
And I think the other thing, too, that's perhaps lacking is that the time frame for women to enter a treatment program they may be out of prison too quickly, and so then the aftercare really isn't there for that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like the whole program lines up with the time that they're serving.
Yeah, certainly sentencing would likely play a role. So if someone's sentenced for 18 months and perhaps they get out earlier, is that enough time to get treatment? I didn't delve into that too deeply, but it's another layer that,
something we'll have to look in the future.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's just an example of the many layers of this issue.
Right. Thank you, Ray. Again, if you or a loved one is struggling with addiction, we have put resources on our opioid crisis page for you on KELOLAND.com.